Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to be looking at the standard metagame breakdown for the standard best of one format. This will potentially be our last metagame breakdown of the year. Got to see how the holiday season is. But going to be taking some time off just to enjoy with family and friends. Hopefully you folks can also do so. But we are going to be looking at the last week or so, the top decks in Mythic Rank, as folks kind of make that last week push into the top 1200, top 250 Mythic, and secure a place in next month's qualifier weekend. So we'll be getting the data from Untapped.gg, what you see on the screen, companion tool that aggregates user win rates, gives us a whole bunch of cool stats, has in-game overlays, whole bunch of cool features. Link for Untapped is in the video description, but I'll paste and timestamp all these deck lists so you can lift and shift to your heart's content. Before we jump into it, folks, we have a couple days left in our charity drive before Christmas. If you see in the top left-hand corner, I'm donating all the money I make from YouTube this month to a local charity ahead of the holiday season. So going to try to get that over to them on Christmas Day. Our goal was 800. We're just a shade under 600 right now. So if you want to help out and kind of make that push, just watch my videos. The more kind of views happen, the more YouTube kind of pays me, the more I can donate to help those in need. We are going to be focusing on a Toronto-based food bank local to me, helping those who may go hungry this holiday season. So let's jump into it. In terms of popularity today, the decks themselves that you're going to see most on the ladder: Mono Red Aggro 13%, Boros Auras at 10%, Mono Black Midrange at about 10%. The Mardu Aggro is basically this Auras deck with the Fling package, Mono Black Discard, Boros Burn, Rakdos Aggro, and then Azorius Control. So the meta is kind of, let me go real fast with red mice, or let's have cut down, go for the throats kind of effects. There's some decks that will cover in between those two archetypes, but that's where a large portion of the meta is kind of focused in right now. We see Mono Red or Boros Auras peaking as high as 38% at one point, and then kind of evening out. So interesting to kind of see where things are going. In terms of the week, we have 63,000 games played in Mythic. So a lot of folks are grinding that best of one life. Highest win rate deck is the stock Mono Red Aggro, 61.8%, 620 games played. So you have your mouse package, Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, the Heartfire Hero. This version here is playing Shock over Lightning Strike. So generally in best of three, you'll sometimes see the Lightning Strike get played. In best of three, there tends to be more mid-range decks like Golgari, a little bit more Dimir mid-range. So the 3 damage can be useful for getting rid of like Enduring Innocence, Glissa, Slasher, stuff of that nature, where in best of one, the meta tends to be a little bit more aggressively slanted. So having access when you're on the draw to be able to kill their turn one play is very important. You know, if they're leading on Heartfire Hero, you want to be able to shock it. Same with the Swift Spear, Higher Claw, stuff of that nature. Basically answering their turn 1 or 2 play when you only have 1 mana. The deck otherwise has been pretty stock from week to week. It's pretty easy deck to get into. And then as you get more reps, you could become more effective with it. But low floor, high ceiling just in terms of win rate. The next deck is a pretty sweet one. So Mono Blue Flash, 61%. So only a couple percentage points, like 0.5% off from the top deck of the week. So this is kind of a bounce tempo element deck. So you have a bunch of flash threats: Fairy Mastermind, Floodpit's Drowner. You have Fear of Imposters, which is a counter spell. They do get a creature behind, but usually I'll trade up in that respect. Faebloom Trick can tap down an attacker, gives you 2 bodies, and then Enduring Curiosity refills your hand. You have a lot of cheap evasive creatures, so it works really nice. Your Spell Stutters, cheap counters, 6 pieces of bounce in between Into the Floodmaw and Unsummon. Mockingbird can copy your other threats or your opponents, and then Storm Chaser's Talent gives you a prowess creature, can rebuy stuff over time. This town ain't big enough, plays really nicely with effects like Floodpit's Drowner, Storm Chaser's Talent, kind of rebuy your stuff, bounce their thing, and go to town that way there. Boros Auras, 60.8, so a percent lower than the Mono Red deck. This deck here has the mouse package, Manifold, Emberheart, and Heartfire, but you also have access to very powerful Sheltered by Ghost, removal, lifelink, and protection. Shardmage Rescues protection. This one's also got Lauren's Escape as some more additional protection. So just really overloading in terms of keeping that creature alive. This deck, you can get very large creatures, but the goal of the deck is to keep that creature alive. So sometimes playing off curve, you have a 2-drop, it doesn't necessarily always mean let me jam my 2-drop on this curve. Sometimes it's worth holding up that extra mana to protect, so that way you can do a lot of damage with this deck in very short order, but keeping your creature alive is very important when half the cards in your deck don't do anything unless you have a creature in play. I still hate Thran Portal, just for the record. Mono black midrange, so 59%. So this is kind of the more midrange version. In the community decks, we will look at a discard focused version. But this deck here, very reasonable into all the creature aggro decks, has a really hard time against the mono white kind of mid-range piles. But built around Unholy Annex, your demon package, card draw, life gain, and a win con in being a 6/6. You have the Slasher Bloodletter combo to one-shot your opponent, some Lilies, you have Deep Cavern Bath for hand hate, whole bunch of cheap removal. The one thing from playing this deck that I did want was trimming on the Edicts perhaps, or like an Anoint with a Fiction, just kind of reconfiguring that I wanted more Go for the Throats, just because if your opponent has Shelly, it can be a bit difficult. Because of these, only this actually hits Shieldred, which made it a little bit difficult in some games I ran into. Nowhere to Run's really nice against any sort of the protection effects, gets around Hexproof or Shroud. Duress is actually pretty reasonable in this format, because even the creature decks tend to have Monstrous Rage, like pump effects, stuff like that. The Auras deck is like half non-creature spells also mixed in. And a really cool land here, Soulstone Sanctuary. You can animate this. It's a demon in addition to its other types, so you get the drain off your opponent that way there. Selesnya Rabbits, 57%. As always with this deck, if you want to play Rabbits, it's a fun deck. It can do super reasonable at best of 1. It is a deck that wild cards will only be spent to use in this deck. So keep that in mind. The only cards that see play outside of this deck are Paw Patch Recruit in the Gruul aggro decks and Night Era Nevios in a bunch of different decks. All the other, Sanguine can see play. All of these other rares and mythics only see play in this deck, so keep that in mind. But it's a creature go wide deck. Things like Hop to It, you have Lord Effects and Valley Quest Caller. The Warren War Leader can buff up your team when it attacks. You could Convoke to get more creatures out. The Valley Might Caller gets bigger, so you kind of put counters on creatures, go wide, and then kind of smack in face that way there. Azorius Control, 55%. So this deck here is just looking to continually say no to your opponent. Authority of the Consuls as a way to stop the haste creatures, gain you some life, buy you some turns. Temporary Lockdown as a sweeper. Now notably Lockdown will hit your authority, so keep that in mind. Same with the Ghost Vacuum, can hit that too. You have Jace as a win condition, as well as Hornlock Whale, Sunfall Token, or usually some of the lands, Restless Anchorage in here, and Fountain Ports. Union can gain you some life, Split Up as a sweeper, just a bunch of kind of cheap removal counters mixed into there. Just kill everything, counter things, and then eventually just win through like mill. You have card advantage engines and Farsight Ritual as a scuffed Memory Deluge style effect. All right, this deck here, I cannot endorse it. I cannot claim it is going to revolutionize things, but just, we'll call it 55%, which is my cut in terms of featuring some decks, but people love Mono Green. I don't see how this deck can consistently beat Mono Red since it doesn't really have interaction. But boy, oh boy, is it Timmy and cool. So Mossborn Hydra is the card in mind here. This card here is a 3-mana 1/1. But whenever you have a land come into play, you double the number of 1/1 counters on it. So you have effects like Map the Frontier. You have Loot that lets you put lands on top of your library into play. You have Lumra here that can bring back lands from your graveyard. You have Fabled Passage, Escape Tunnel that can kind of trigger in terms of being 2 land effects. You get mana from Nissa when that happens. Bristly Bill can put counters on it. So there's kind of the Aftermath Analyst plan with Lumra where you self-mill to put lands into play with a Hydra. Just can make a really big creature, try to kill them that way there. All right, some community decks. So this is the Mono Black Discard deck. This one's from Kello. They went 77 and 24. Somehow only played Mono Red 6 times. So that's usually what I like to check. They bet up the Boros Auras deck. It seems like they're positive win rates against most of the decks except Golgari. This deck here, heavier on the discard package. So built around Bandit's talent. That's kind of the payoff for just stripping your opponent of cards. Things like Hopeless Nightmare, Ruthless Negotiation in here. Liliana's, you have Slasher, Thought Stalker, Warlock as a way to kind of eat at the hands. Full set of Shelly. So strip them out of all their stuff. Slam a Shelly oftentimes can win games if they can't answer it for a couple turns. But kind of the core concept. The one thing I will say with this deck that just jumps out to me, a lot of 3/4s, 5s, and only 22 lands. I would probably want to see 23 to 24 in this deck. Next deck, we have the Azorius Glyph deck. This one from Pichivo went 85 and 42. Reasonable against mono red, reasonable against mono black, which you'd like to see. Sub against Boros, but still a really nice win rate. This deck here is looking, it's kind of an Azorius Artifact aggro-ish deck. Leyline Axe, if you're a skilled gamer like the mono red Leyline, always in your opening hand, obviously. Get this into play. Then you have just ways like you go wide with a bunch of artifacts, stuff like that. You can tap it to Warden. Bunnycorn gets really big. You give it double strike trample, or you give it flying with the Steel Seraph. Sheltered by Ghost plays really nicely. Regal Bunnycorn can be very difficult for the mono red decks to deal with if you get it out of pace in terms of like their damage. Zoetic Glyph animates your various artifacts, and then you have Mockingbird that can copy like Bunnycorn or Steel Seraph, stuff like that. Then go to, this one is from Ricart. They went 58 and 33. It is Selesnya Tokens, so kind of a take on the Caretaker's Talent deck. So 11-0 versus mono black. These Caretaker Talent decks usually have a really good time against that deck. Sub against mono red, and okay against Boros. I usually like looking at kind of the top 3 decks in that case. But if you want to beat up mono black, something like this works really well. So Caretaker's Talent, obviously the card. Dare I say you should likely be playing 4 of this very powerful card, but it's also playing up the Beanstalk in here. We have a card here, Case of the Locked House. You can play additional lands on each of your turn. You could solve the case if you have 7 or more lands, and when solved, you look at the top card of your library anytime and play lands and cast creature spells from the top of your library. So we can kind of go from there. Leyline Binding as removal. You have just kind of different various token enablers, virtues, Sunfall. You have Overlord of the Hauntwoods. The land token also counts as a token for Caretaker's Talent. You win with Mistmore's, Overlord, Nissa, or just a big White Sun Zenith as well. And then lastly, we have from Ardstafor, 123 and 81. This is black-white life gain combo. So this deck here is a Raise the Pass combo. Cheap creatures, gain some life. If stuff dies, you don't really care. Snarling Gorehound can put stuff into your graveyard. Then you kind of mass reanimate with Raise the Past. So things entering the battlefield will gain you life. You drain them with things like Starscape Cleric. And then when creatures die, you have your opponent lose life. So you sacrifice them to things like Bartholomew. And then you have like the Blood Artist style effects in the deck. You can disregard the sideboard. It doesn't really here. That's it for the week. Let me know what you've been playing, what you've been liking, and we will catch you next time. Thanks for watching.